So we've been dealing with morality, and we've been looking at the moral argument for God's existence. And you'll remember the argument goes as follows. If God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values. There are objective moral values, and therefore God exists. This is a very basic, what we call a syllogism, a two-premised argument that yields a conclusion. And this is following a logical rule known as modus tollens, where we deny the consequence so that we can deny the antecedent. And we've been looking at arguments for and against the existence of objective moral values. Who here among my students can recount the threefold case against the objectivity of moral values and or the case for ethical relativism? We had three arguments. Yes. Yeah, so the diversity thesis or argument, the dependency thesis or the dependency argument, and then the queerness argument. Now, would you like to give a very brief exposition of each of those arguments?
The diversity one is that there's too many standards for morality, so there can't just be one. There can't be one objective.
Mm-hmm.
And the dependency is that it depends on how you're raised, I think.
Yes.
And I don't know the last one.
Yes. Okay. So the first two, there's so many diverse standards of morality and conclusions about morality that surely there are no objective moral values. And the flip side of that coin is that we depend upon our culture and our family and so forth for the development of our understanding of morality. And since all cultural ethical education is culturally dependent, it therefore follows that since cultures differ in time and clime, then we have to say that there are no objective moral values. Okay. And then who can recount the queerness argument? Yes.
Basically that it's strange that morality would be outside of us, outside of our minds, so therefore it can't be true.
Yes, it is just weird to the thought that, like, don't slurp your soup at the table would be this thing floating around in the ether somewhere. That's just bizarre. We've never run into anything like an objective moral value. It's contrary to our experience. And so we must reject these ideas of these really existent perceptions of morality or conceptions of morality. It's virtually incoherent to even think that such is the case. Now the problem with that third argument is it really just is a prejudice against Platonism. You're basically just saying there can be no abstract invariant principles that just exist in an immaterial way. So that's I'm not defending Platonism, but you're going to have to give me more than a prejudice. Okay. What is the refutation of the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis? Who would like to refute those two theses? Or you can refute one. You can just pick one that you want to refute if you want to.
The diversity argument conflates the principle and the exemplification of the principle.
Very good. So diversity, as Caleb just said, conflates exemplification with principle. So all you're proving is that different people have different beliefs, but that doesn't have anything to do with whether those beliefs correspond to something objective. Even if every single human being had a different set of moral values than his neighbor or her neighbor, and even if every single human being had a set of moral values that do not correspond to reality, which to me is an extreme point. Even on those two assumptions, that wouldn't prove that there are no objective moral values. It would just mean that nobody in the human race ever encountered them or believes the right ones. And it's at least logically possible that one person has the right set of values. So diversity doesn't prove non-objectivity. Or diversity of subjective opinions does not prove that there are no objective opinions. Okay. What about dependency? How do we refute that? The dependency thesis.
Everything just because we learn or just because we learn objective moral values or what we think are values in society doesn't mean that doesn't mean we couldn't learn them some other way.
Yes, and the fact that I learn my values from my family, for example, does not in any way show whether or not they're objective. After all, I learn math from my family and my culture. I learn scientific principles from my culture. Is the world any less spherical just because I learned it from my culture? So many things that I know because of my language and the time in which I'm living and so on and so forth. But that has nothing to do with the objectivity of my beliefs. Okay, yes.
Could you turn the question back to the person who's raising that objection?
Sure.
And say, well, aren't you a product of this culture? How, by definition, therefore, can you trust your own conclusion on the subject?
That's exactly right. And there is a parity, isn't there, between the ethical relativists and the religious pluralists. Many religious pluralists will say there can't be one true religion because, after all, you wouldn't be a Christian had you not been raised in America. If you were raised in Saudi Arabia, guess what religion you'd probably be? Muslim. Well, that just proves that religion is culturally bound. And then you can say to that person, well, what culture were you raised in? Would you be a religious pluralist if you were being raised in Saudi Arabia? So that kind of argument itself refutes itself. So the fact that I learn my values from my culture plays onto you as well, Mr. Relativist. The reason you're a relativist is because you learned that meta-ethic while being raised in a society such as ours. So, any questions about those arguments for relativism? I mean, we went over these in some detail.
Wouldn't it? I feel like we can refute. I haven't thought this story out yet. But we can refute one or both of those with the fact that every culture does have its own religion. Like, if every
Right.
culture has its own religion, where did they all come from? They did have to come from outside of them somehow.
Every religion comes outside of the individual. And so now the question is every religion culturally bound? Or is there at least one religion that comes from outside any culture?
Well, that's my point.
Yeah.
If you-
I'm putting your point. I'm trying to put your point in another way. Yeah, but yeah.
I mean, it's got to come from somewhere, or they wouldn't all be different.
That's exactly right. And same thing with values. And one of the most interesting thing about this debate, and I didn't put this as an argument for objectivism, but people have used it. And some of you are familiar with C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, which is a really great primer on setting forth the case for objectivism. And he points out that the diversity in value between different cultures is far more exaggerated than what's really going on. If you look at cultures across the board, the same basic values exist from one culture to another. You're not going to find a culture out there that just praises cowardice or denounces courage. We may disagree as to whether this person here is courageous and whether this person acted as a coward. But everyone would agree that if this person was acting cowardly, that person was acting in a morally substandard way. Yeah. Or slurping the soup is the example I gave last week. Both are exemplifications of a principle, and this goes back to your point about exemplification. The principle is you should respect those who do you a service by making you a meal. But it's exemplified in one culture a little bit differently than another. In the East, we slurp our soup to express just how much we enjoy the meal. In the West, you don't, at least traditionally, you don't, because making noises at the table like that are just rude. Okay, and you're not showing the host good manners, good proper manners when you do that. So you're disrespecting them in a sense. And don't all of us agree that you should respect those who host a meal and have you over for a meal and so on and so forth? Okay. Now, can you turn around and flip it, and can you actually set forth a case for objectivism? And I found that these three arguments are really effective. And again, I'm not going to repeat everything I said last week. Relativism is self-defeating. I personally have never met a relativist. You can't actually live this philosophy out without shooting yourself in the foot. I know relativists who go and protest unjust wars. I guarantee you that if we went to the No Kings rally that happened last week, and were to go up to the average person and say, are you an ethical relativist? Do you believe that values are relative? Many of them would say, what are you talking about? They may not have even thought of the subject. But if you unpacked what you meant by that, I guarantee you that the vast majority of them would have said, yes, I am a relativist. And then I would say, is there anything wrong with establishing a monarchy here in America? Well, that would be horrible. Well, guess what? You're not a relativist. You believe that it's morally wrong for a president to contradict the Constitution by establishing a monarchy here in America. By the way, I do too. Right? But I'm an objectivist. And so it would be objectively morally wrong for Trump to do that. Well, if they are saying that, then they are showing that they are not relativist. Now, the response, the good response to this is to say what the first argument against relativism is doing is it's refuting subjectivism, which is the idea that morals are relative from person to person. And what most relativists embrace is called sociocultural relativism or conventionalism. And sociocultural relativism says that values are relative to culture. And that's why I went into the next argument, which is called the moral reformer's dilemma. If relativism is true, then there are no moral reformers. But there are moral reformers, and therefore sociocultural relativism is not true. A moral reformer would be somebody who stands against the values of his culture and or against a convention of his culture and says, this is wrong, we need to change. Hopefully all of you understand that if sociocultural relativism is true, then any so-called moral reformer is actually a moral deviant. This person is by definition immoral. That means Martin Luther King was immoral. Why? Because he stood against many of the values in the South. Frederick Douglass was immoral. Why? Because he stood against slavery. And that was a cultural norm. Not just in the South, by the way. It was actually fairly normative in the North, in the sense that many of your northern businessmen participated in the slave trade. Okay? And many Northerners didn't care about freeing slaves. You know, we don't do that, but we don't care if anybody else does. Okay. Do you all understand the moral reformer's dilemma? So if you do believe that there have been people in history that rightly stood against the values of their culture and said that those values are wrong and tried to reform the culture accordingly, and they were right to do so, you by definition cannot be a socio-cultural relativist. All right. And then finally, I gave one self-evidently true objective moral principle. And here it is: don't torture babies for the fun of it. If you believe that that is not only true, but self-evidently so, you know that there is at least one objectively true moral value. Okay. Any questions about our case for objectivism? We could stop here and just say, great, we've established objective moral values, let's move on. But this actually becomes a wonderful little apologetic for God's existence. And I think all of you sitting in here have certain proclivities, certain dispositions, certain likes. And what I'm getting at here is that some arguments for God's existence really appeal to you, and then some seem a little abstract to you or a little bit too hard to understand or whatever, and so you shy away from them. Some of you have a science background, and so some of the design arguments that are out there I think would be very appealing to you. Or you might even like some of the arguments coming out of astrophysics. Some of you are more philosophically bent, and you may like the cosmological argument. Now, what I'm getting at is I think every Christian should master one of those types of arguments: the design argument, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and have that as part of your quiver with your arrows in it. And so one of the arrows in your quiver should be one of those classical arguments for God's existence. And you should spend some time just developing your understanding of the argument so that at any time you run into a non-Christian out there, you're ready to go. Always be ready to give a defense for the hope that is in you. The moral argument is universal in the sense that I think every Christian should master this argument. Because it's so practical. And it's a very quick and easy apologetic. The vast majority of people who hear this are going to go, yeah, I've never really thought of it like that. Yeah, there's got to be a God. So let's go to that first premise. I'm sorry for the typo here, but here it is. If God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values. So why should we think that that premise is true? Well, if there is no God, then moral values are brute facts, which is counterintuitive. Values are grounded in persons, not inert matter, nor impersonal abstracta. Now, what do I mean by impersonal abstracta? I'm going back to abstract objects, and this plays into the queerness argument that J.L. Mackie gave. J.L. Mackie is saying that it's just bizarre to think that there are these abstract things called moral values, like don't torture babies for the fun of it, just floating around out there. And we theists can agree with him. That's why we don't ground these abstract, universal, invariant moral principles in just nothing. We ground them in a person, a mind who contemplates these values. Same thing with matter. Matter can only give us indicatives. Matter cannot give us imperatives. Does it make sense to all of you? Raise your hand if that does not make sense or you want me to unpack that. You want me to unpack that? I point out here for B, bare matter or anything that ultimately exists for no rhyme or reason can only cough out indicatives. So take a rock, for example. Can a rock be the source of a moral value? Can a rock say what ought to be? I know I am, says the rock, but I ought not be, or I ought to be. Does that make any sense to any of you? I would say that makes no sense. No rock could ever cough out an imperative like thou shalt not. A rock only just exists, and so anything that the rock utters, quote unquote utters, whether it's metaphorical or not, is just going to be what is. The rock just is. Now, if every single thing that exists in the universe is just matter in motion, then there are no genuine imperatives. There are no statements concerning what ought to be. This is David Hume's famous insight that you cannot derive an ought from an is. It's one thing to watch a parent beat a child. That is what is. It's another thing altogether to say that that is what ought to be. Okay? And matter can only tell you what is. Matter cannot tell you what ought to be. How we doing? Is that fair? We're all understanding on that argument? Okay. If there is no God, here's another argument for the first premise. If there is no God, then morality is no longer prescriptive, but merely descriptive, which contradicts the very meaning of a moral value. Morality is no longer prescriptive, but descriptive. We all understand the difference between a description and a prescription. Again, what is and what ought to be. Think about what the universe would be like if God doesn't exist and there are objective moral values. So just try to imagine this world. The universe popped into being uncaused out of nothing. And when it popped into being uncaused out of nothing, along with all of the parameters that are necessary for life to exist, being right there at the beginning, it also created these objective ways in which people ought to live. And then for billions and billions of years of cosmic evolution, these values just sat around and waited for human beings to arrive on the scene so that we could appreciate them. Does that sound rational to any of you? No, me neither. And that goes back to the queerness argument. That is just bizarre. Well, agreed. That's why we believe that there is a God who's always contemplated these values and has actually imposed them on the human race as ways we ought to live. Any intelligent creature endowed with the freedom of the will has a set of moral values that they ought to live by. And that's whether you're talking about an angel or a human being or any other type of intelligent creature. And then for those of you that, probably the one argument that most of you are probably familiar with is this last one. Intuitively, if there is a moral prescription, there must be a moral prescriber. If there's a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. And I find that to be self-evident, especially in light of the other arguments that I just gave you. So, any questions about why I think premise 1 is true? You'll also notice about the moral argument that you've already established not just any kind of God, but the God of the Abrahamic traditions. If you go to Greece, and by Greece I don't mean actually going to the place we call Greece, but if you go to Greek philosophy and you read their philosophers, one of the things that you'll notice is they make no connection between God and morality. So for those of you that may be familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma, which we're about to discuss, Plato, in the dialogue called the Euthyphro, clearly states that morality exists and transcends the gods. So for Plato, he does not offer us anything resembling an ethical monotheism, where values are located in God's nature. Morality transcends the gods, and so in a sense, the gods are irrelevant when it comes to morality. The gods may be relevant in giving us an explanation for why the world exists, but they are irrelevant in terms of telling us how to live our lives. What's the one tradition or set of traditions out there which connect God and morality in a very intimate way? Mosaic monotheism, Abrahamic theism, right? Biblical theism, if you will. Does that make sense to all of you? So the moral argument goes a long way in establishing not just that any God exists, but the God of Abraham exists. Can I switch slides here? Are we good to go?
Can I see the last one for another, just a minute?
Sure. As I'm reading these, B and C are just two ways of saying the same thing, but that's fine. If this were a course in ethics, we would probably spend 3 weeks on the issue of metaethics, maybe even a month.
What do you say to the Darwinist who is like, well, I mean, we just discovered, like, through, random chance made it so that we value survival and life. So, therefore, that's our morality, but it doesn't exist outside of
Right.
humans.
Right. The neo-Darwinist is a socio-cultural relativist. So that he thinks that if he can tell a coherent story as to how we came to know these values, then he has established their non-objectivity. And giving me a coherent story as to how I come to know has nothing to do with the objectivity of those values. What the socio-cultural relativist is doing at that point is failing to distinguish moral epistemology with moral ontology. How I come to know these values is a distinct issue from whether the values are objective. And so, in the context of this argument, you can say, hey, I don't really care how, I'm not asking the question of moral epistemology. As long as we are discovering those values instead of inventing them, what does it matter if we came to it through a long process of sociocultural evolution, divine revelation, or somewheres in between? It doesn't matter. The point is that these values that we've discovered are indeed objective. Yes.
I've met people with that belief, and they kind of do believe in the objective moral value, but the objective moral value is just the survival of the collective. So they're like, we wouldn't do anything that would harm the collective, or like we wouldn't harm ourselves, or we wouldn't
Right.
bring humanity down. But if, I don't know, like killing a baby would advance society, then it's okay, because it's like
Right.
advancing the collective.
Your typical neo-Darwinist is a sociocultural relativist, and they might say, we've come to realize that really what matters is the collective and not the individual. Okay? And so they're going to adopt a set of values. Now, you need to appreciate at least one point, and I'm not going to get into normative ethics on this point, but to give a normative ethical point, their collectivism is nightmarish. Okay? Because they have no place for individual human rights in this system. But I'm going to retreat now from the normative ethical point to go back to meta-ethics. That's just same verse, third verse, same as the first, a little bit longer, a little bit worse. They just want to keep repeating the point in different ways, and don't let them get off of the game. Again, you're postulating that the human race is objectively morally valuable, which just is an embracement of objectivism. Okay, and one of the questions I would like to ask is, how do you know that? How do you know that the human race is objectively morally valuable? If they say, well, it's not really truly objectively morally valuable, then your collective has no value. So you're acting as an objectivist, but you have a theory that cuts against that. So you're contradicting yourself. Now, they may say, well, just because I can't apply it doesn't mean it's false. But remember, last week I told you that ethics is the one is the one branch of philosophy where your inability to apply it is extremely relevant to whether it's true or not as an ethic. I can't apply Einstein's theory of relativity to my daily life, but that has no bearing on whether the theory is true or false, right? But if you can't actually apply your ethic, that has great bearing on whether your ethic is true or false, because ethics just is a practical it's the practical branch of philosophy. Okay? This is why this argument is so effective, because it hits your daily life. Whether the universe had a beginning or not, you can choose not to answer that question. Whether there are objective moral values or not, you can't choose not to answer that question. Okay? Because every day when you're arguing with somebody over whether what they did was good or bad, you're invoking some standard for behavior. And so if you say the collective is good, I would just say, is the collective objectively good? Or is it subjectively good? If we as a culture just arbitrarily have come to the conclusion that as subjects, that the human race is objectively good, that wouldn't ground the objective goodness of human nature or the human race. Because a gazillion's subjective opinions has the objective value of 0. And all of you know what 0 times infinity is. Right? And so the only way you can uphold the value of the collective is if you believe that there is a mind outside the collective that is bequeathed objective goodness and said, this collective has intrinsic value. Which, by the way, also becomes a very effective argument that leads into the normative ethic that I think that we should all embrace, which is a kind of integration of really all the main normative ethics. Raise your hand if you don't know what normative ethics really refers to. So we're all on the same page as to what normative ethics is. So who here can give me the 3 broad normative ethics or ethical systems? So I'm breaking my own promise. I'm actually getting into this. Yeah, go ahead.
Deontology, Utilitarianism.
Very good. So deontological ethics would be an ethical normative ethic that says the measure of a value is the principle itself, or the duty that I have to follow the principle itself, and full stop. So there's an intrinsic value in the command itself. Utilitarianism, the slogan is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but really utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethic that says the value of a principle is in its consequences. Right. So a utilitarian is going to read the 10 Commandments and he's going to look at the first 4 commandments and say, that has no practical value whatsoever. Who cares what day you worship on? To quote George Carlin, spooky language. Spooky language, that's all that is. Okay? And so, how do you measure the value of an ethical principle? Well, you look at its consequences. If you doing this has no real bearing on the future, has no consequences in culture, then you should be free to do it, period. End of story. That's all there is to say. Okay? And then finally, virtue ethics says, really the value of a principle is found in whatever virtues it instills in me as a person. So the goal of ethics is to make me a better person. That's really what this is all about. It's also called archaic ethics. Okay? And Christianity is, the normative ethic of Christianity is really a integration of all 3, but it stresses deontology and virtue. Okay? I personally want to grow in righteousness and holiness and so forth. And the principles themselves are an means to that, and in a lot of ways they are the ends in themselves. Okay? So what are the 2 basic values of Christian ethics? Mm-hmm. Okay, and yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just move forward and tell all of you that Christian ethics, the way I teach this is I make a distinction between value and principle. Okay? Once I set forth the case for objective moral values, I then make a distinction to my students, and I will say, what we value or hold up as ideal is ultimate or penultimate for us, and then the principles that I live by exist to serve those values. Now, our Lord gave us our 2 basic values. What are they? So, yeah, were you saying the same thing? He was given the 2 great commandments.
It sounded better.
What did you say?
The same thing, I think.
Okay. So the 2 greatest commandments are there because the 2 greatest values are in those 2 greatest commandments. So the values are God as our summum bonum. He is our highest good. And then right below God is humanity, because humanity is made in the image of God. And so because human beings have intrinsic value, that is why we have these principles. So please understand, the principles serve those 2 values. And this actually gives you a lot of material from which you can build a very strong ethical structure in your mind. Because now you have all the principles, you have principles that are placed and they are structured according to that. Right? So here's a question that ethicists will wrestle with. Is it good to lie to save a life? The Nazi knocks on your door and says, are there Jews in your cellar? And let's just say that there are. Do you lie to save the life of the Jews in the cellar, or do you tell the truth? Now, some deontological systems will say you tell the truth. Immanuel Kant famously said that. I have to do duty for duty's sake. That's deontology, right? Duty for duty's sake. And if I'm asked a question, I tell the truth. The consequences be damned. To quote the old Stoics, let justice reign that the heavens may fall. They are the quintessential deontologists, right? Justice must reign that the heavens may fall. So you lie. You don't lie. You never, ever, 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 never, 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 never lie. Ever. Is Kant right? Very good. Very good. The Bible actually gives a counterexample of that. In Exodus, we are told that as the Hebrew children were being killed, Pharaoh gave that order, there were certain Hebrew midwives that hid many of the children away and lied to Pharaoh. And what does the Lord do to them? It says he blessed them for what they were doing. And there are ethicists in the past, even St. Augustine, as great as he is, I have to disagree with him on this. He said, well, the Lord didn't honor their lie, he only honored their piety. And you're like, no, he clearly honored the behavior of these midwives. So the Christian actually has a deontological ethic, but it's a structured one. We call it hierarchical objectivism. And here's the way I would put it. Under what circumstances, the question is, under what circumstances do I not follow a moral principle? And the answer, given everything I've just told you, is that if following the principle undermines the very point for which the principle is given, then I must follow a higher principle. So, why do I not lie to my neighbor? Okay. It injures, to lie to my neighbor will injure on some level my relationship with that person. And really what I'm doing if I lie to that person is I'm basically saying, you don't matter. But my neighbor's made in God's image. Does my neighbor matter? Even the pagan living next door to you is made in God's image, and therefore you are not to lie to your neighbor. But he hates God, yes, but he's made in God's image, and therefore you are to treat him with kindness and respect. Why? Because he's made in God's image. And therefore he has intrinsic value. And therefore when you lie to him, you are saying you are not what you are. You are not a person of intrinsic value. Okay? Do you see how I'm treating my neighbor as an end in himself and not a means to an end? People in our culture and in so many other cultures use other people as means to ends. They use people to get things. And we are called to use things to bless people. Right? So if I lie to him, I'm doing that. Now, what if the Nazi knocks on my door and says, are there Jews in the cellar? Or what if the Egyptians come to me and say, are there any Hebrew children in your home? If I tell them the truth, I am undermining the very point for which the principle is given. The principle is given to preserve the value of humanity. And in this particular instance, if I tell the truth, I'm undermining that value for which the principle is given. And this is why I lie. And it's good for me to lie, because I'm preserving the life of, in this case, a human baby or a Jew or whoever. And so, it's the same thing if someone comes into your home and they threaten your family, do you have the right to use force to stop them, even up to the point of killing them? But thou shalt not murder, right? But is it murder to kill a person in self-defense? And I think most of us would say no. I am not to just go up to somebody and kill them for the fun of it. But if someone threatens me, then I'm actually preserving the value, not just of me, but in this case, my family. And so allowing him to get away with it would undermine the very point for which thou shalt not murder is given. And therefore, I go ahead and take his life. And you should sleep very soundly at night if you go ahead and kill that person. So.
And what about if it's just you that you're protecting?
Yeah, I have the right to protect myself because I'm made in God's image. I have intrinsic value. Love your neighbor as yourself. The self-love is already assumed in the equation, right? You're not commanded to love yourself. You already do. What about the person who commits suicide? Are they loving themselves? It is a distorted version of self-love. They think that something good is going to come from the suicide. Right? Now, it's a very sad situation, extremely sad situation, but they are seeing themselves as loving themselves by doing this. What about the person who has an eating disorder and they will not feed themselves or eat healthy? They are still engaging with a distorted understanding of self-love. They think that they're loving themselves by improving their appearance, by not eating. Okay. How are we doing? Do all of you understand what I mean by hierarchical objectivism? This is sometimes called graded absolutism. I've not solved every single one of your moral dilemmas that you're going to run into in your life, but you at least now have at least a broad structure for understanding these things. And we have this all throughout the New Testament. Jesus will speak of the weightier matters of the law. Right? Well, how could you even speak that way if you didn't have a hierarchy of principles that you follow? So you strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, Jesus says. What does he mean by that? Well, you go to those principles on the Torah that are good to follow, obviously. But they are certainly not what the Torah stresses. The Torah stresses that the elders of Israel are to care for those in need, to do their best to make sure that the poor go to bed with clothing and that they are fed. And you are weighing on them all of these principles that are not even in the Torah, or they are extrapolations from the Torah. And now these people are miserable and they are resentful. And you just pass over these other principles. Was it good for David to go into the temple to eat the showbread, which was considered sacred? Yeah, because human life is really what the temple was given to preserve. And so breaking that commandment for the sake of saving a life is okay. And so Jesus shows forth his hierarchical objectivism all the time, all throughout the Gospels. Okay. Before we get to one more issue, any questions about what I've stated? Anything? Anyone? Here is an objective. Here's an objection. I'm going to give two basic objections to the moral argument. The argument from moral epistemology: I don't need God to know the difference between right and wrong, or I know lots of people who are moral and yet they don't believe in God. Have you ever heard that one? Okay. So you tell me, how might we respond to this sort of objection? Okay. One argument is to say you have a kind of moralistic attitude, but that doesn't mean you are moral. But there's a more rhetorically forceful way to overcome this objection.
Actually, responding to this person, I would probably start with a question of how do you know the difference between right and wrong? If you don't, that would be right.
That is a good question. Here's one way to respond to them. I'm not saying that you're not moral. No, we're not talking about you and how you act. So this is not an attack on atheists as persons. This is an attack on atheism as a philosophy. Okay? And again, you're confusing moral epistemology with moral ontology. We're not saying that you can't be a good person without believing in God, in the sense that you're not going to go rob stores or murder somebody or gossip or so. I know atheists that are very good people. Okay, but the question is, does calling these actions good make any sense in an atheistic universe? That's the question. Y'all see the difference between the two? We're not saying you're not a good person. We're saying that if you are a good person, that statement can only have meaning in a theistic context where there are objective moral values. Raise your hand if you don't understand my response. Okay. This is the more sophisticated one. Is the good good because God wills it, or does God will it because it is good? That's fun. Is the good good because God wills it? Let's say that the good is good because God wills it. That means that do not murder, that is good only because God wills that be good, right? It's wholly based on God's arbitrary will. Now, there are two problems with that. This is the view called voluntarism, that morality is grounded in the will of God. Okay? So God just went eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and just arbitrarily said, I think killing people is not a good thing, so we're going to have a law against murder. Right? Two problems with the voluntarist. First, if the good is because God wills it, then morality becomes relative all over again. Second of all, God could change his mind and will that murdering babies for the fun of it is okay tomorrow, in which case morality is always going to change. In fact, there is a version of Abrahamic theism that does that very thing as a matter of principle. What religion am I thinking of? Islam. The vast majority of Muslims are voluntarists. Okay? So, in Surah 2, verse 256, there shall be no compulsion in religion. But then when you get to Surah 9, the last surah of the Quran, kill the infidel. God changed his mind. This is called the theory of abrogation. Later surahs abrogate what earlier surahs say. Okay? Are there Christian voluntarists? In history, there have been, but they've been the vast minority of philosophers have been voluntarists in the Christian tradition. William Malcolm is one of them. Most Christians are essentialists, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So y'all understand why we can't go with the first prong. We can't say that the good is good because God wills it. Raise your hand if you don't understand why. Yeah, okay. Or the second prong, does God will it because it is good? That is, you have this thing called goodness, and God conforms his will to the good. What's the problem with that? Yeah, the good would be greater than God. So God would lose his transcendence on that model. Okay? Now on both options, and this is where the atheist is going to wax eloquent, on both options God becomes irrelevant to morality. Okay? What is the traditional Christian answer to this dilemma? That's right. God is the good. It's an essential part of his character, and therefore God wills it because he is good. And he is the standard of morality or ethics or value, not anything outside of him. He is the measure of all that is good and moral. Okay. Any questions about the moral argument for God's existence? Why don't we use this time to take a break? This is a great time to break because when we come back, we're going to say maybe just a few more words about this, and then we're going to get into the Sermon on the Mount. So let us break.